The studio fell silent as the talk show host sneered, "You're just another angry black woman." Viola Davis locked eyes with him, her voice calm but razor-sharp. What she said next would leave everyone speechless. Subscribe now to see how this inspiring story unfolds. The studio lights blazed like 1,000 suns, but the room froze as the talk show host leaned back in his chair, a smirk twisting his lips. "Let's be honest, Viola," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Aren't you just another angry black woman?" The audience gasped, the air thick with tension. Viola Davis sat perfectly still, her hands resting gracefully on her lap. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto the host's. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then she leaned forward, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "Angry?" she repeated, letting the word hang in the air. The host chuckled, clearly expecting her to falter. "Come on, we've all seen the interviews, the speeches," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "You're always so intense. Isn't it exhausting?" The audience shifted uncomfortably, some murmuring in disapproval, others waiting to see how Viola would respond. Viola's lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes remained steely. "What you call anger," she began, her voice low and deliberate, "I call passion. What you call intensity, I call conviction." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But I suppose it's easier to dismiss me than to listen." The host's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, leaning forward as if to challenge her. "Listen to what? The same old stories about race and inequality?" he scoffed. "Don't you think it's time to move on?" The audience tensed, some exchanging uneasy glances, others leaning forward in anticipation. Viola's gaze never wavered. "Move on?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Tell that to the mothers burying their children. Tell that to the communities fighting for justice." She leaned back, her tone softening but no less powerful. "But you're right about one thing. I am angry. And I have every right to be." The room fell silent, no one daring to breathe. The host leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning as if he'd scored a point. "See, there it is again," he said, gesturing to Viola like she was a specimen under a microscope. "That fire, that anger. Isn't it just exhausting to carry all that around?" The audience murmured, some nodding hesitantly, others glaring at the host. Viola's expression didn't change, but her eyes burned brighter. "Exhausting?" she repeated, her voice steady but laced with quiet fury. "What's exhausting is explaining to people like you why my anger is justified. What's exhausting is fighting for basic dignity in a world that tries to silence me." The room grew still, her words cutting through the air like a knife. The host raised an eyebrow, clearly unprepared for her response. "Oh, come on, Viola," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "You're an award-winning actress, a household name. What more do you want? A parade?" A few nervous laughs trickled from the audience, but most sat in stunned silence. Viola's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "What I want," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "is for you to understand that success doesn't erase pain. That fame doesn't shield me from injustice." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But I don't expect you to understand. Privilege has a way of blinding people." The host's face flushed, his confidence wavering for the first time. "Privilege?" he shot back, his voice rising. "I worked hard for everything I have. Don't act like you're the only one who struggled." The audience gasped, the tension in the room reaching a boiling point. Viola leaned forward, her gaze unyielding. "Struggle isn't a competition," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "But when your struggle is weaponized against you, when it's used to dismiss your voice, that's when it becomes a battle." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "And trust me, I've never lost a battle." The room erupted in whispers, the host visibly shaken. But Viola wasn't done. The host opened his mouth to respond, but Viola raised a hand, silencing him before he could speak. "Let me tell you a story," she said, her voice calm but commanding. The audience leaned forward, captivated, while the host shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "When I was a little girl," Viola began, her eyes softening as if she were reliving the memory. "My mother told me something I'll never forget. She said, 'Baby, the world will try to tell you who you are, but only you get to decide.'" The room grew quieter, her words weaving a spell over everyone present. The host rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. "Cute story," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But what does that have to do with anything?" A few audience members hissed in disapproval, but Viola remained unshaken. "It has everything to do with this," she replied, her voice steady but firm. "Because you don't get to define me. You don't get to reduce me to a stereotype or a soundbite." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "And neither does anyone else." The host leaned forward, his face red with frustration. "Oh, come on, Viola," he snapped. "You're making this about you when it's not. This is just a conversation." The audience gasped, some shaking their heads, others murmuring in disbelief. Viola's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, a flicker of anger broke through her calm exterior. "A conversation?" she repeated, her voice rising. "No, this is a confrontation. And if you can't handle that, then maybe you're not as good at your job as you think." The room erupted in applause, the host visibly flinching, but Viola wasn't finished. "What happens next?" she said, her tone dropping to a whisper. "Will show us who you really are." The host stared at Viola, his mouth slightly open, as if searching for a retort but finding none. The audience held its breath, the air thick with anticipation. Viola leaned forward, her voice steady but filled with quiet power. "You asked me if I'm angry," she said, her eyes locked onto his. "Let me tell you why I am." She paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment. "I'm angry because every time a black woman speaks her truth, she's labeled as angry or difficult. I'm angry because we have to fight twice as hard for half as much. And I'm angry because people like you," she said, pointing at the host, "think you have the right to dismiss us." The host shifted uncomfortably, his confidence crumbling under the weight of her words. I wasn't trying to dismiss you," he stammered, his voice uncharacteristically weak. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, others glaring at the host. Viola's gaze softened, but her voice remained firm. "Maybe you weren't," she said. "But that's the problem. You don't even see it. You don't see how your words, your tone, your assumptions, they all add up. They all hurt." She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And I'm tired of pretending they don't." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Even the host seemed momentarily speechless, his usual bravado replaced by something resembling shame. Viola took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But here's the thing," she said. "I'm not just angry. I'm hopeful. Because every time I speak, every time I stand up, I'm showing someone else that they can too." The audience erupted into applause, some people standing, others wiping away tears. The host sat back in his chair, his face pale, his usual smirk nowhere to be found. Viola leaned back, her expression calm but resolute. "So, no," she said, her voice ringing out. "I'm not just another angry black woman. I'm Viola Davis, and I'm just getting started." The room exploded into cheers, the host shrinking under the weight of her truth. The applause slowly died down, but the energy in the room remained electric. Viola sat tall, her posture regal, her expression calm but radiant. The host, still visibly shaken, cleared his throat and attempted to regain his composure. "Well," he said, forcing a weak smile, "that was certainly something." Viola turned to him, her gaze steady but not unkind. "It was the truth," she said simply. "And sometimes the truth is hard to hear." The audience murmured in agreement, some nodding, others still wiping away tears. The host nodded awkwardly, clearly out of his depth. She turned back to the audience, her voice warm but filled with conviction. "To everyone watching," she said, "I want you to know this. Your anger is valid, your pain is valid, and your voice matters." The room erupted into cheers again, some people standing to clap, others shouting words of encouragement. Viola smiled, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and gratitude. "But don't let anyone tell you that's all you are," she continued. "You are more than your struggles. You are more than your pain. You are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are enough." The audience roared, their applause echoing like thunder. The host, now completely deflated, managed a small nod. "Thank you, Viola," he said, his voice uncharacteristically sincere. "That was powerful." Viola turned to him, her expression softening. "Thank you for listening," she replied. "That's all any of us want, to be heard." As the credits began to roll, the camera lingered on Viola, her face a picture of strength and grace. The audience, still buzzing with emotion, began to file out, their conversations filled with admiration and inspiration. And as the screen faded to black, one thing was clear. Viola Davis hadn't just won the moment. She'd changed it.